Hi, my name is Mario Veen, and this is one of the final episodes of this podcast about philosophy and medical education. I will discuss the article Mind the Gap, a philosophical analysis of Reflection's many benefits, with its authors Sven Schaepkens and Thijs Lijster. Sven Schaepkens is a PhD candidate at the Erasmus University Medical Centre in the Netherlands. He studied reflection in practice in the Dutch General Practitioner Specialty Training since 2019. Thijs Lijster is a philosopher who works as Assistant Professor of Philosophy of Art and Culture at the Department of Arts, Culture and Media Studies of the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. The article we discussed today was published as part of the Philosophy in Medical Education series of the journal Teaching and Learning in Medicine. It will also be part of the edited volume that Anna Cianciolo and myself are publishing in August. This book is called Helping a Field See Itself, Envisioning a Philosophy of Medical Education. You can order it through the link in the description. Welcome, Sven and Thijs. Thank you so much for your article. I just reread it this afternoon, and it's such a good article.
Thank you.
I'm really happy to discuss it with you. Thijs, you're not from medical education, you're a philosopher. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and why, when Sven approached you, why did you say yes?
Yeah, sure. So indeed, I am my background is in philosophy, and then specifically philosophy of culture and art. So in that regard, my expertise and my topics are rather removed from the field of medical education. But the reason why I became fascinated after Sven's invitation was because I did see several connections to my own research interests, and perhaps I can mention two. So my own background, like I said, is in philosophy and particularly also critical theory. My PhD thesis, for instance, was about art criticism and the way in which art criticism can also function as a form of social and political criticism. And one of the things in art criticism, which I think is interesting, is that you are looking for a kind of argument regarding beauty, for instance, or regarding the quality of a work of art in the absence of fixed rules. Because very often in the debate around art criticism, it is sometimes said that you cannot have art criticism if there aren't any clear rules. But I would argue the exact opposite way, that only if these rules are gone in modernity, when all kinds of rules regarding beauty and art were thrown overboard, that is the moment when art criticism emerges, and that you get this kind of conversation about beauty and about art in which people are basically trying to build a ship in open sea without any kind of solid ground under their feet. You need to build an argument. You need to find truth in a way, even if there isn't a kind of solid fundament there. That was one way that I saw a kind of parallel with how reflection and critical thought was functioning in the field of medical education, and this precise argument, of course, we will discuss later. One other way in which I found interesting, which is perhaps more related indeed to the philosophy of culture, is that a kind of contemporary culture of neoliberalism is very often characterized based on the overabundance of protocols, rules, red tape that are, of course, very often also part of frustration of professionals in the field of education, but also in law or indeed in medicine. and that this is sometimes referred to as a kind of form of deprofessionalization, that because you have all these, let's say, fixed rules and protocols, it's basically a kind of distrust of the professional, right? That constantly needs to account for every decision, every move that they make.
Yeah, so because there are sometimes no clear rules, that's why you have space for reflection in medical education, and you also need to be professional in these circumstances where there's like ambiguity and it's not clear what you need to do by the book.
Yeah, precisely. Especially reflection in a way that this is kind of one of the main thoughts in our article. I guess that reflection takes place precisely where there's a gap between theory and practice, right? Where you cannot immediately rely on the theory in order to make a practical decision.
I'd like to get more into how because you're kind of an outsider to this field, and I think it's always very interesting when outsiders are, trying to say something inside a field, because they can offer, also fresh perspective, I think. Mm-hmm. But Sven, you're a friend of the show, of course. We've spoken to you before, but maybe you could tell a little bit about yourself and say something about, because you've been studying reflection in medical education for a couple of years now, and what are your conclusions so far?
Let me be humble. I don't think I have very fixed conclusions just yet. So having studied reflection for the last year, particularly in the context of the GP specialty training in the Netherlands, I have a couple of observations to make, and maybe others can draw the definitive conclusions about, my observations. The first is that having been speaking to GP trainees, GP teachers, sort of observing the field, also as a philosopher and an interactions researcher, I've noticed particular, let's say, ways of speaking about a reflection that constitute a particular, let's say, reflexive or educational culture. And I'd like to think about the sort of unsaid or alternatives to how people develop this culture in, the practices regarding reflection education, the activities that they do to instill reflection, and what I've noticed in working on this particular study with Thijs is when you read reflection or studies on reflection and reflection literature, you quickly notice that in the medical education field, there's a lot of talk about the benefits of reflection. Now, Thijs and I don't deny that reflection has certain benefits, but what was striking to me at first instance, having read this literature for a while and following in it, is that I noticed there are so many benefits that at some point you think, wow, just put on the reflection button and so many problems will disappear. So to just quote a couple, reflection can reduce burnout. People say it increases empathy, it could decrease stress, it develops professionalism, it refines clinical skills, it helps practitioners transition from theory to practice. And as Thijs already mentioned, reflection seems to be very important to sort of bridge a theory-practice gap. So, reflection becomes this kind of fix-it-all kind of mechanism that we need to instill in our future, medical professions, including the GP trainees. Now, I'm not against figuring out what all these effects are, but I found it conceptually and philosophically interesting to think about the opposite, as we argue in the paper. When there is reflection to bridge reflection, when reflection is there to bridge theory from practice, it also implies that there is a kind of gap. And in this case, this gap is particularly interesting. And with Thijs, we looked into a couple of philosophies in relation to the medical education field, particularly Kant, Hannah Arendt, Heidegger, and Derrida. to look at this problem, not a problem, this beneficial side of reflection from the perspective of the gap or the aporia. So because these philosophers, these continental philosophers, argue that for human reason, for human experience in general, the aporia or the gap is quite important and it's vital. And to think about reflection as a means to bridge this gap and to kind of flip that on its head and figure out what particular other presuppositions are still hidden there. This is why I was interested in taking a closer look at all these wonderful benefits that reflection supposedly have.
And can you give an example of such a gap?
So the main gap that is in the literature is quite often mentioned as reflection helps people to cross the theory to the practice, and there's a gap between those two, and we've noticed that in the works of the philosophers that were just mentioned, they also discuss a similar kind of gap. So for instance, when we draw from Kant, there is a sort of explanation of this phenomenon by thinking about chess. So, for instance, when we all learn the rules of chess, the issue is, okay, I've learned the basics of chess, but in order to make a good move in chess, well, that is hard to define in a particular specific rule. And that is where Kant becomes interesting, because he says, well, we can't make rules to apply rules and to keep on defining rules to apply rules in practice. No, at some point you just kind of have to use the rules and create a dialogue between the rules that you know and the concrete practical situation that you're confronted with from the world, and then kind of jump or apply or practice kind of what it means to apply a good move, rather than just simply reapplying a rule. I hope that was kind of clear, though.
Yeah, then a move in that case would be asking what question are you going to ask the patient, or what diagnosis, how do you make your diagnosis, something like that.
Yeah, so the gaps from medical education would be indeed okay, how can you apply certain standards to a particular case, and these can be medical standards, but also, for instance, standards how we should deal with doctor-patient communication. There's particular guidelines of how you should engage with patients, but sometimes these guidelines get in the way of the practical situation. And then, what is a correct move if the guidelines say A, but perhaps the situation asks slightly different interpretation of the rules? So that is where the gap sort of originates, or kind of becomes prominent, and you can't ignore that gap, and you can't just fall back on, and these were the protocols, and this is how I'm going to do it. Well, that probably is not what the situation at hand required from you. Rather, it's a constant dialogue between what the protocols say and what the situation requires. So that is the gap from theory to practice.
Yeah, great. So Thijs, I positioned you before as kind of an outsider to the field, and you already mentioned some parallels with culture and your work as a philosopher of culture. Are there also things that you noticed about reflection in medical education that surprised you, or that the way that medical education approaches reflection that stood out for you, that's maybe different than what you're used to?
Yeah, I guess what stood out for me, at least in part, was the kind of ideal that was sometimes implicitly hidden in the discourse around reflection. The ideal that reflection itself could completely be protocolized, so to say, or catched in rules, or in a kind of fixed form of education, and hence also be trained in a very strict way. This in a way was not a big surprise, because I also realized that, especially in medical education, it is very necessary to to be able to teach all the rules and to have let's say a proper rubrics and proper learning outcomes and so all the kinds of things that I myself were also familiar with as a lecturer at a university were I recognized in the field of medical education, but perhaps in an even more extreme form. And there, I think this idea of the gap that Sven and I constantly came back to becomes very interesting, because in a way, what we end up arguing, and perhaps we will get to that more in detail later. But what we our conclusion in a way is also that you need to accept that this gap can never be completely filled, so to say, that this gap will also will in a way always be there. And there I was indeed reminded, and we discussed this also in our article, of certain insights in especially continental philosophy, indeed in what Sven just called the aporia, as it is theorized by figures like Kierkegaard and Jacques Derrida.
And what's aporia?
It's basically a gap, or indeed an opening. And what they mean by this, and especially Kierkegaard as a quite an extreme way of phrasing this, because he says that in every decision there's a moment of madness. And what he means by this is that you indeed, to make an actual decision, you can never completely rely on the theory or on the rules, because that in a way would not then it would no longer be a decision, then it would be merely a calculation. So if you make indeed a mathematical calculation, you never have to make a decision, because the conclusion follows, let's say, in a straight line from everything that you have calculated. But a actual decision is something quite different, because there are indeed, of course, you know the theory, you know the rules, but still, indeed, as Sven just explained, you still need to apply the rules. So a judge, for instance, has been trained in the law, and he knows the law, he knows all the rules, but still to be able to apply the law to this particular case and say whether indeed the defendant is guilty or not guilty, according to Kierkegaard, there is a moment of madness in there, and this indeed is in a way already proven by the fact that different judges might make different decisions, right? And different jurors might make different decisions. And so in a way, these are moments which resist the kind of full calculation or full protocolization. But this makes them also very interesting, I think, and thought-provoking. And these are precisely, I think, the moments where professionalism, in a way, comes to light.
So that's where you find the professionalism as well, and the connection with reflection. But so, Sven, why is it that the gap cannot be filled? Because there's a lot of articles as well, when they speak about theory and practice gaps, it's always about bridging the gap or filling the gap. But you're saying that's not possible fundamentally. It's not just, an ideal that we might never achieve it, but you're saying it's a wrong ideal, or it's not the right ideal to have?
I don't mind it as an ideal per se, although we could criticize perhaps the ideal for various reasons, but I think it is more fundamentally impossible. So another gap that we highlighted with the work from the continental philosophers that we use in our article is the gap between the individual and the communal, or the communal sense of what the profession means. So the moment that let's say I, as an individual professional, make a certain choice, it doesn't per se mean that everyone in my stead who is also a professional would make the exact same choice. Now, the issue is that everybody kind of has a position in this community, and you're trying to figure out, when you're reflecting, what your individual sense of the case at hand is in relation to the communal sense. But these two positions are not fixed, in the sense that the communal sense is not always a monolith that is always the same at every time, at every space where you, let's say, find this communal sense, right? Because throughout time, the communal sense, or let's say the professionals who make the community, they change their norms and beliefs and values due to the experience that they have as individuals or as a group. They change. New members become part of this group, and that also creates a different way of understanding, what the norms and values are, from, let's say, a communal perspective of what the profession should be. So in that regard, the individual sense, it might seem stable from your own single position, but there's a constant dialogue between yourself and this community that you have to relate with, and that you sort of together construct the profession with.
I'm very interested in this myself in two contexts, actually. One is planetary health, where you see there's also a difference in generations, because there's maybe still, let's say, a communal sense about what is our responsibility as professionals in the climate crisis, where what are the limits of our profession? Should you be an activist or not? How far does your responsibility reach? And then I think there are many individuals who actually, they become either climate activists, or they do see within their profession a much larger responsibility, right? And another example that comes to mind is in technological innovation. Like, we had a lot of chatter about ChatGPT, and I think this is another thing that comes up that prompts reflection, right? Like, now we have this thing called ChatGPT. How is it integrated in our profession? Can we use it in diagnosis of patients or not?
Yeah.
Do you see it that way? Do you see these gaps there?
Yeah, I completely see them as well. Also in the data that I look at. So the data that we use for a couple of our studies in my PhD are drawn from weekly reflection rounds at the GP Specialty Training Institute, the university. And how I'd like to see this is that, there's about 10 individual GP trainees who come together with their own ideas and thoughts about, what their profession is. And they're supervised by two teachers who, of course, have a lot more experience with, being in this profession. But then, they start sharing experiences. For instance, one that we quote in the article is one from a GP trainee who is criticized for how she picks up the phone when she speaks to patients. And then she kind of she doesn't really know how to deal with it. And this was feedback from her supervisor. And then in that particular case discussion, she asks, okay, what do you guys think of this, right? Her peers, and how do you deal with this? And then, in this way, and I see it in the data constantly on many topics that are relevant for GPs, ranging from what do you do medically with this case, to how do I deal with this particular patient, or how do I deal with my supervisor, etc. Those are ways of calibrating your communal sense as an individual who brings in an own case, and this constant calibration is very intriguing to me, because on the one hand, they have inherited a type of speaking, ideas about what the ideal practitioner should look like, but then these concrete experiences that they share, they push back perhaps a bit on these ideals, or maybe they affirm some of the prejudices or assumptions that they have. But each time that they start talking and discussing about these cases, kind of they reactivate and reconstruct, and therefore rethink, what it means to be in this profession, and calibrate their individual sense against the communal sense. And I find these reflection rounds therefore very fertile grounds to see this process of socialization, but also personification going on. Like I find it fascinating because it all happens there.
Yeah, and then these concrete details of how do you answer the phone and what do you say?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It can't be more practical than that. But that becomes a problem if a supervisor tells a GP trainee, like, you're picking up the phone wrong, right? Like, okay, how do you deal with that? And how do others deal with that? And then, and that spins into like this calibration of like, okay, what does it mean to receive such feedback from a supervisor? And what can I say?
Thijs, how do you see that? Because these are also, of course, larger cultural trends around climate, around technology. Of course, there's also many societal developments.
Yeah, but perhaps I can indeed respond to your final or your second example of the technological developments. And here I was reminded of this. Since you mentioned ChatGTP and all the concerns in the field of education around that, I was also reminded of I think something that the philosopher Slavoj Žižek said, that if now all students let their thesis write by ChatGTP, then we as professors, we just let them grade. We let ChatGTP grade all the papers, and then everyone can do something better with
go outside and go for a picnic.
Yeah, precisely. Which I found very, very funny. But of course, the concern about these technologies is, I think, justified to that extent that, well, for a couple of reasons. One reason is, of course, that artificial intelligence, as we mostly know, is perhaps not as artificial nor as intelligent as it sometimes pretends to be, in the sense that of course a lot of actual human work and human labor goes into it, which also means that it suffers from the same kinds of biases and the same kinds of errors that human intelligence suffers from. And this is sometimes also referred to as the garbage in, garbage out principle. If you, let's say, include racist data in a system, then also racist data, then it's also not surprising that the system is going to be racist, as we have seen in the case of the Dutch scandal with the toeslagenaffaire. How would you
let's say the tax service profiled people as high risk? I guess they would get controls, extra controls, and the basis of that was an algorithm, and that algorithm was, well, let's say, racist.
Yeah, precisely, indeed. So that is, I think, one concern, that if we outsource basically these kinds of decisions to systems, then we need to take into account that they are suffering probably from the same kinds of biases that we ourselves are suffering from. But I guess even more principal point is indeed this outsourcing itself, that once you, let's say, outsource your intelligence to algorithms, or even indeed all kinds of protocols and rules, then it sometimes can, in an extreme form, it can mean that you do no longer judge yourself. And this is sometimes indeed something I also see in the case of my own practices as an educator, that sometimes you are so busy following the protocols and filling in the forms that you lose sight of actually judging about, let's say, a thesis or a work that a student has done. And I think this kind of pretension that you can catch all these moments of decision making into forms, into rules, into protocols, I think this is an ideal that is indeed, as Sven just said, impossible. But it also, in a way, loses sight of the kind of human moment, which is this moment of madness in a way that is part of any form of decision making.
So that's what I really like about your paper. It's kind of a strange paper in the sense of if you compare it to the paper formats that you usually see in medical education, because it seems to start out as kind of a literature review, like what are the benefits of reflection? But then actually the literature, the benefits, you say, well, it's strange that one thing has so many benefits. So that's kind of a critical note, and it becomes quite critical. But it seems that what you are saying here is that, well, you need, especially in times of artificial intelligence and protocolization, you need a reflective practitioner there. So you need not just someone who executes, let's say, the outcome of algorithms or calculations or protocols, but you need a human being there who is conscious and applies the rules, and even if that means that there's like a moment of madness, that there's something like madness, I would say irrationality, or you could say more positively, say creativity.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like you're very much making a plea for, and Sven, you kind of have to do that because your PhD is on reflection. So you kind of have to make a plea for it, right? So I happen to know Sven because I'm also your co-promoter. So your research question of your PhD, of which this article is a part, is how do we make reflection concrete and valuable for, in your case, GP residents? So could you speak a little bit about how this story fits into your thesis and into answering that research question?
Yeah, so as I said in the beginning, what I've seen happening in the literature is that we tend to have this urgency, this inclination to figure out how stuff exactly works, empirically validate it, show that if you do reflection in a certain way, these are the outcomes. It reduces stress. It makes everybody more empathetic, and et cetera, et cetera. And once you sort of adopt our, perspective from the gap, that the gap will always be there, and that it is actually then quite challenging to truly pinpoint these effects empirically, like, that reflection will relate to certain, and especially all the many benefits that are mentioned in the literature. Then I started thinking about, okay, what is the alternative if I want to, keep the gap intact? What is the alternative? What can I say about the reflection that is happening on the GP, in the GP specialty training, and the data that I'm looking at that comes from this particular place? So, how can I say something about reflection if I don't want to measure its effects exactly, if I don't want to protocolize it in a very tight sort of rules-based method or table that students could follow? What is left to me? And now the answer to that is, we look at, for instance, group reflection sessions or supervisor sessions, and the people involved in this, the teachers and the GP trainees, they claim that they're doing reflection there. So that actually takes a little bit of the pressure off of my shoulders as a researcher, in the sense that, okay, you turn me towards what you think is reflection, and I'm going to look. So what we do in our research is bracket all these particular theories or conceptualizations about reflection as much as possible, and just start looking at the way people speak to each other, the things that they do or don't do in these reflection sessions. And I do that as an interactions researcher, as I mentioned before. So to give you an example, with a colleague of mine, Marije van Braak, we have looked at the data, and we've noticed that, for instance, emotions seem to be very important to speak about in this reflexive setting. We have 40 recordings of these group reflection sessions, and there's about 180 cases that are being discussed in there. And quite a few have an emotional dimension in there. And now that was very striking to us, because in a previous study that we did, Marije showed that the GP trainees find it important to reflect on emotions, but they also say that sometimes, the teachers or even their peers, keep on nagging about the emotions so much, right? So there's an interesting tension there, that on the one hand, they say, okay, talking about, reflecting on emotions is important, but on the other hand, doing it sort of wrong or weirdly is also a bit annoying. So we kind of took that indication from the participants and started looking into data. So, okay, first, can we find an orientation to the norm, that emotions are important? And we found it. And then secondly, we took that evidence and thought, okay, if emotions are so important to this reflexive setting, how do people talk about emotions? How do they mobilize it? How do they put emotions on the table? And what we've noticed are a couple of practices that, on the one hand, sometimes these practices are very effective to indeed table emotions. And sometimes we see similar practices that just completely make talking about emotions ineffective. So in that way, we're trying to map the education reflexive culture in this particular setting and try to understand how reflection comes to be and how the people talk with each other creates a kind of education and reflexive culture. And what I finally want to say is basically what I'm suggesting is there is no single way, for instance, to reflect about emotions in this particular way. There are multiple ways that you can address emotions, and each one has a different kind of effect depending on the situation. So what I'm trying to show is I'm mapping basically this reflexive culture and trying to show it like a sort of sampling card, like a paint sampling card. So imagine that you go to, the hardware store and pick out paint for your walls. Then there's blue and yellow and green and all the shades in between. And that's how I think about reflection. There's multiple shades that people can use, and I'm mapping as much of these colors as possible. And I will not pinpoint that blue is the best color. I will pinpoint there's a range of colors that you can use to make reflection effective and create a particular reflexive culture and socialize your GP trainees into this culture, and that they're not just fixated on, reflection on emotion always means that, I have to feel about it in a certain way. No, there's many ways that you can discuss emotions. Now, emotions is one example, but I'm also looking at perspective shifts after resistance or the appearance of particular norms. So there's many ways that, you can map reflection without saying, if you follow these steps, this is the outcome, and then be done with it. So that's why I use this metaphor of the sampling card.
Yeah, so Thijs, as a philosopher of culture, you must like it that Sven is using the concept of reflexive culture.
Definitely. I think that this is a very important way of looking at it, not only because of the word culture, but also because it indeed emphasizes the, let's say, social dimension of reflection. I guess very often also perhaps in the kind of popular imagination, when we think of reflection, or more broadly, when we think of thinking, or reflection as thinking about thinking, then we imagine, let's say, le penseur of Rodin. So a figure who is completely rolled into himself and who is closed off from the outside world. He is reflecting, right? If we are thinking about...
Yeah, or like someone looking in the mirror. It's one person looking in the mirror at themselves.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Well, I think what Sven just emphasized, and what we also emphasize in our article, is precisely that reflection is never an individual, or at least not solely an individual endeavor, and that for reflection it is very important to take other viewpoints into account. Of course, in part this can also be done on one's own, if you are thinking about what might another person do or what might another person think. This can also be part of reflection, but ideally it is also something that is publicly shared and publicly communicated. And I think there, perhaps to come full circle also towards my own interest in art criticism, there I think there's also an interesting link with thinking about art. It's not for nothing that where Kant writes about the reflective judgment and emphasizes the importance of reflection, he does that in the context of the aesthetic judgment. So in thinking about art. especially because there these kinds of fixed rules and the kind of solid ground of truth is lacking. And there it makes it even more tangible, perhaps, than in other spheres, that that you need to, or that ideally you come to some kind of agreement. Because, well, perhaps today we might say, well, aesthetic taste is purely particular or purely subjective, but at least Kant believed that indeed it might be subjective as a kind of feeling, but at the same time we are striving towards or looking at or aiming towards some kind of universality in our aesthetic judgments. So that is something indeed that is very much part of a culture, I would say, and a culture indeed of reflection. You might think in terms of within a professional setting, but I would also say indeed in a society at large that you can speak of a culture that is more or less reflective.
What are some concrete recommendations based on your paper?
Well, I think I would answer in the following way. So the fact that researchers try to figure out the effects of reflection, I'm not against that. Just to be clear, right? I'm just trying to look at the same problem or the same challenge from a different perspective. So, and second, if researchers come up or if teachers come up with kind of a stepwise entry on how reflection could be done, that is also fine with me. I'm not against models of reflection as such, but as I said, I'm trying to look at reflection as a kind of reflexive culture that exists in a particular institute, and how the participants involved, from the teachers who designed the curriculum to the GPs in training, or the students who need to wrestle with what the teachers provide them. That is what I'm trying to figure out, and how that creates a particular way of meaningful reflection for these people in this particular institute. And now, as I said, based on our kind of two gaps that we highlighted through the philosophy, on the one hand, the gap between practice and theory, and on the other hand, the individual and the communal sense, then I would emphasize that, at least from our perspective, that activities that increase the communal aspect is, in our view, kind of we prefer that type of activity, because I don't think that writing a portfolio or a reflexive text for yourself is in any way bad. But what we see in our data, though, is that the presence of peers in a healthy reflexive setting helps push your individual sense beyond what you might have possibly imagined, because you're getting feedback from them, you're getting a resistance from them on your perspective. So this exchange between, like, bridging the theory practice gap by talking about it with others is something that, based on our argumentation, you should nurture, cherish, and stimulate in a particular medical education curriculum. So that is one of the most concrete ones that I think comes out of our argumentation. And secondly, when you want to create a healthy kind of, in my view, a kind of healthy reflexive culture, and based on our argumentation, you should perhaps be a little bit hesitant when it comes to assessing reflection, because assessment implies that you could figure out as an assessor if someone reflected particularly well, if they followed the rules or not, if they used the protocol well, if they went through the steps successively and properly. Whereas we're trying to argue, okay, some people might be able to, follow and execute a nice reflexive structure following a particular model, but for others, this model might not so much work, and there might be ways that the model constrains them. And then to argue, you've reflected wrongly because you missed out on step 5, I don't know if that is particularly helpful, and you have to, I think, be a bit humble in assessing reflection that way. And again, to draw from our data, so I know of a couple of these models that have a sort of 5-step phase, and when you look at people kind of talking to each other in these reflexive sessions, I think some of these case discussions are super deep and layered, but they're like missing out on step 5 or step 3, right? And am I then the one to say like, here, this is, you've reflected wrongly or not deep enough? No, I think that's quite odd to say, and I think you should be humble and careful to assess reflection that way. Now, this doesn't mean that you need to help show trainees how reflection can be done. And this is the third recommendation that we have, that we kind of, it's a bit of a joke, but it's also meant seriously. You can't learn reflection, but you need to practice it. And with that, we mean to say, I will not test you on if you've done a good reflection and followed all the steps. No, what I would like to do is socialize you in practicing how to talk about your profession with other professionals, albeit teachers, supervisors, or fellow trainees. And it's the practice part that makes you jump the theory practice gap. It's not learning the rules. Yeah, well, you need to learn the rules at some point to make a jump, but like it's the jumping that needs to be practiced a little bit, and that can be done in a safe, reflexive environment, such as a group reflection session where people find safety and comfort to speak their mind, but where there is also maybe some space for respectful disagreement.
Thank you so much. And Thijs, I'm going to ask you a little bit of a different final question, because this article is part of the series in Teaching and Learning in Medicine, but it's also a chapter in an edited volume, which is more generally about the value of philosophy for medical education. So for people who are listening who are interested in philosophy, do you have any tips or where do you start if you want to get into philosophy more as a medical education professional?
That's a good question. Well, I'm not completely sure whether this would be the best place to start, but perhaps
don't start with Kant.
No, don't start with Kant. No. I was actually thinking about one of my own philosophical heroes, which is Theodor Adorno, who is also not that easy to read. So again, I would not be sure to start with him. But one of the reasons that I mention him is that he, together with colleagues, talk about what they call instrumental rationality, and it's very much in line with what Sven said earlier, that reflection or rationality is conceived of very often in a kind of very one-dimensional way, as a kind of goal-oriented trajectory to get stuff done, and for them this was a kind of perversion of how rationality was meant in the Enlightenment, which was more of a kind of open-minded way to approach the world, dogmatism, and all those kinds of things. So that for me has been a great inspiration also in thinking about the things that Sven and I have been dealing with. Again, I'm not entirely sure whether that would be also the best place to start. Perhaps one other tip, which is from a rather different direction, is a book which is pretty readable by I think Swedish philosopher Martin Haglund, and the book is called This Life, and it is about mortality and about human fragility, and I think it, in a way, perhaps especially also for medical professionals, in a way it also makes you humble towards indeed what human existence and what human life is about.
And you're very humble, of course, not to mention your own books, but I will link them in the description so people can look at your work as well. Well, thank you both so much.
Well, thank you for having us.
Likewise.